Can I get the icon in cornflower blue?
All right, hey everybody, welcome to episode 9 of the Can I Get That Software in Blue podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Chad Tindel, and along with me is my esteemed co-host, Steve Mayzak.
Hey Chad, hey everybody.
One thing I want to talk about, Steve, and this is kind of, Brian, you know, this is a long-running joke here, is that Thailand has been our number 2 market for a long time, but it's not anymore.
Who's number one?
Yeah, of course, United States is the big-time number 1, but actually the numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all tied at 3%, United Kingdom, Belgium, Canada, and Germany. So there you go. Yeah, we're growing into EMEA.
I love it.
I like looking at these stats. Not that I care so much about the stats. It's not like we're doing this to juke our numbers or, you know, sell subscriptions to anything or something. We're not selling vitamins here, but it is fun to look at every once in a while. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, right.
Sad to see Thailand leave the list, though.
Maybe they'll come back. They'll be a contender.
There was also this really cool tool I wanted to show you guys. Somebody posted this on Reddit. It's a site called rephonic.com, and they're just selling services to podcasts. There's a bunch of these, but they have this really cool thing. Well, first of all, you can search for a podcast on here, and you can put any podcast name that you want in. Can I get that software in blue? Search for podcasts, and our podcast comes up, and you can see, you know, things about it. But they have this. It's not really well advertised, but if you go back to the main page and you just go all the way down to the bottom in the fine print, under resources, they have this podcast audience graph tool, and you can put in the name of a podcast, and it will give you podcasts. It's basically a podcast recommendation engine. And I thought it was pretty cool because when I pulled it up, it's a nice little 3D graph here. You can zoom in on it. You see us in the middle, and then everything that people might be interested in that we're connected to. But right here in the middle down here, of course, the All In podcast.
Oh, it came up right on.
Yeah, right there. You see, we're friends of the All In podcast here. In fact, I'm wearing my All In podcast hoodie, my besties hoodie. And I love this podcast. In fact, it's one of the few podcasts that I actually wait for it to launch. It comes out about midnight on Fridays, and I wait for it, and I stay up late, and I listen to it every week. It's just, I look forward to it so much. Of course, Jay Cal is the host of that podcast, and he's got his other This Week in Startups podcast, which shows up. So I really like this tool, and I was happy to see that it actually worked, which means that some of these other podcasts I might want to listen to. Of course, I'm still trying to make my first million, so maybe I should listen to this. I don't know. But it's a fun little tool to play with. If you guys want to see other podcasts that you might like, come in here, put in your favorite podcast, and see what gets recommended.
Yeah, that's very cool. It reminds me of the Elastic Graph tool that we used to sell when I was there.
It does feel very much like the Elastic Graph tool. You're absolutely right.
I wonder if it's powered by that.
Yeah, they don't say. So they posted it on Reddit as like, oh, we just built this. If you want to try this out. I went and I was like, oh, it's actually really cool. All right. Well, this is our first episode with a CEO guest. Okay, we're excited to be joined today by our guest, Brian Stevens. When it comes to open source royalty, most people might think of people like Linus Torvalds, Richard Stallman, maybe even Miguel de Icaza. But honestly, in my opinion, Brian's done more for the adoption of open source in the enterprise than probably anybody on the planet. I know Brian from my days at Red Hat when he was the EVP and CTO, and where he was basically the brains behind growing Red Hat to the point of it being the largest software acquisition in history when IBM acquired them a couple years ago. He was instrumental in the maturation of Linux to the enterprise with the creation of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Of course, before that, Red Hat was primarily sold in shrink-wrap boxes for desktop users. Remember the days of Linux on the desktop? I think it's still coming. But then he got into the application server space by acquiring JBoss, got into the identity management space by acquiring Identix, and of course correctly identified Kubernetes as the future of enterprise application deployment and orchestration, leading to the relaunch of Red Hat's OpenShift product, which I think originally was launched as a platform as a service after we acquired Makara, if I remember correctly back in the day. Is that right, Brian?
Pretty close.
Pretty close. Okay.
Well, we'd actually started it a little bit before that, and we bought Makara for the perform. They had a really good performance analytics engine visualization, and so we wanted to integrate that into OpenShift.
Got it. And now OpenShift, of course, is the Kubernetes platform. I remember we went to dinner with Jan-Mark Holzer at Oya in Manhattan a few years ago. Of course, Jan is very famous at the restaurant Oya in Boston, has his own chair with his name on a plaque that's attached to the chair. And they opened a Manhattan location, and you guys were in town. We went out. I think Brent Holden was there. He's now the Field CTO of HashiCorp, and a previous guest on our podcast a couple episodes back.
That was fun.
Well, I remember waking up the next day to read in the news that you were leaving Red Hat to take over as VP and CTO of Google Cloud. And at the time, I remember thinking that was it just felt like a strange move given how far behind they were compared to AWS at the time. But of course, you helped grow Google Cloud into a powerhouse that's doing something like $20 billion in revenue a year now, which is phenomenal. Brian's also served on many boards of major organizations like Nutanix, Pentaho, IEEE, and the American Red Cross. And he's now the CEO of Boston-based machine learning startup Neural Magic, which we're going to dive into in a little bit. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Chad.
And we're glad to have you.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, I'm excited. I woke up so excited. I hit the gym. I was swimming in the pool. I'm like pumped right now.
Old home day coming back.
Well, let's start off with talking about where you're at now. Neural Magic, you recently raised a $30 million Series A round, and that's such a huge A round. I can't believe how big these A rounds are. We have some friends from Elastic who have gone over to ClickHouse. They recently had done a $50 million A round, and then I think a $250 million B round, which is wild. So I wanted to start off by asking, why are Series A rounds so much bigger than they used to be? I think when I was at Previty, we did an $8 million Series A round, and that was 2015. It was only 6-7 years ago.
Yeah, well, as I tell the team there, and much to their nervousness, I tell them, well, I've never done this before. I've never raised money for a company. It's always been public companies with great brands and great resources, and then just trying to figure things out, right? And trying to like expand the value that a company, existing company, typically brings to a customer. So this was a little different for me, but yeah, the numbers are huge. It's just ridiculous. And I think some of that, one is because everybody's trying to invest in the future, now more than anything else, everything going digital, et cetera, and crypto and AI. And then the other is, it's just there's other sources of funding now. It used to be you had to, go Sand Hill Road. And now, there's all kinds of, capital funds out there that are actually really super aggressive. So it's much more competitive on the funder side. Bully to the founders, that they have better access to capital.
That's awesome. Well, you had mentioned that you could have even taken probably more than 30 million in an A round if you wanted to, but you decided not to because that has other trade-offs. Can you talk to us about, what are really the trade-offs of taking more money versus less money early on? And how do you decide how much you want to take in an A round if you could go bigger? What's that decision-making process?
It's really that balance. You can take more money. Clearly, that's going to come with dilution. But the more money you have, the more runway you have. So I think you have to have, in my mind, like when you're raising an A, you have to kind of know what the B is going to look like, and you really want to know like what's the path to adoption, and how long do you need, and what do you need for a team, and so we really looked at that really hard. Unless you're not going to need a future round, then everything's different. But if you are, what I didn't want is I didn't want to set ourselves up for failure for a B round. Like if you come in and get a monster valuation at an A, then you're going to have to get a mega monster for your B. So you better be pretty confident, right, on what those metrics or OKRs are going to look like. So I thought, where we landed it really well because it showed the value that and what the team had already done, the people before me, what they really already built at the company. And so I recognized that then while getting them, more than a couple of years of runway before they have to think about raising a B. So I felt like that right compromise, to be honest.
Brian, when you think about like the timing from Series A to Series B to Series C and all these things, like some companies have raised D and E and F rounds. Like, how do you think about the timing of that? Like, when is the right time to go for Series B or Series C?
Before you need it, I think is the answer to that. And so for us, it was probably 6-ish months end to end, kind of, before when you started thinking about like, building decks and having conversations. And then we were lucky that we didn't have to really finish the planned raise because we just had Greg Papadopoulos and NEA. Greg was already coming to every board meeting, already was a prior investor. He saw what I say is the good, bad, and the ugly of the company, right? Because all companies, like, you can't just paint roses.
Yeah.
There's obviously other things. And so he saw all that with great transparency for the prior year. So he really accelerated the process for us and closed it out where I didn't have to like continue looking for outside investors. And so that was nice. I think it's different for every company. I think a lot of companies can go to market really quickly. Maybe you're building something in the social space. We're solving this really hard and meaty problem, building the future, what people usually do in hardware. But we're doing it in software to build an accelerator. It's really difficult. The amount of investment and the amount of time, just the technical difficulty in that, you're not going to go to market 6 months after you launch a company. And so we really recognize that. We think a lot about, for us, we felt like, we wanted about 2 years of distance between races is kind of the best case for us. And so we mapped everything out there. We mapped the technology roadmap, we mapped the skills that we need, and that felt about right. Trying to do it sooner than that, I think, would be really difficult. If you push it out too far, then you're going too lean, right? Because the market waits for nobody, right? So you have to go fast enough.
That's right. I was reading on the website that you guys, it seems like you're trying to build this system modeled after how the brain works a little bit. So do you have neuroscientists on staff? Like how does that work?
The founder, Neil Schwab, was, how you always say, like, they wrote the book on, well, he really, he did write the book on, multi-core programming. And so he became like a multi-core expert. And then he started learning a lot more and studying about how the brain works. And he started putting those two things together with AI. And he tells the story so much better. So I'll really mess this up. But the way he thinks about it is your brain's got, the power of an LED light bulb, but it's got so much memory.
Yeah.
But when you're thinking of something, you're thinking of a person's name, you're identifying an object, you don't light your whole brain up, right? You would melt down. But your brain finds the right path through the right neurons to, make that prediction that, that's a bobcat in my backyard. So with that, the world that we're in right now to process AI on the inference side, which is where we are, where you deploy, thinks about how do you throw supercomputers at that problem? Like how do the models are getting bigger and bigger and bigger? And then how do you need so much compute to process the models, and you're processing it all in parallel. And what Nir was saying and was thinking about was, what if we actually built a software engine that modeled the brain where you didn't have to run all the compute, you didn't process all the layers in parallel. Instead, you figured out the layers that pass through the neural network that mattered. What we do is this technique called sparsity.
Yeah.
And what we do is we take these big models, instead of needing a big NVIDIA or other CPUs that people are building for, or other ASICs that people are building for these things. Instead, we analyze the model and we figure out the parts of the model that matter. And what that means is we can usually reduce the model by 90%. So now it starts to feel more like your brain. You need a lot less compute power to process the models, but yet you still retain accuracy. So the model is just as good, typically within 1% of accuracy of the original model, but it's shrunk by 95%. And the amount of compute has shrunk by that proportional amount. So now you don't need these HPC things to run these models for inference. And then the problem moves to becoming a memory problem. You're moving memory around.
Yeah.
And so the engine handles that part as well. So it actually deals with how do we never leave L2 cache if at all possible. Okay. So you run these models really efficiently, and then you can run them on just a random 2-core, 24-core on AWS, Google Cloud. Like, you can run it anywhere.
Brian, I was curious, like, do you feel like the way that you guys are approaching this problem will change how we approach things like overfitting and things like that, or is it still the same bias in the models?
It doesn't really. What we do is it doesn't change that, because we typically start what I call from our open source days, right? Upstream models.
Okay.
So what we'll do is we'll start with a pre-trained model that came out of Google or Microsoft, and they publish these models, and the models are state of the art. BIOS, unfortunately, overfitting's already been introduced in the model at that point, or has been remedied in the model. So we really pick the best in class models that often people typically can't run, because of the amount of compute power required to run these models is too much. And we make it so that it's not. So we're bringing like the best models to any use case everywhere.
As we learn more about how the human brain works, I imagine that will only go to influence how we build AI in the future. Like, do you think that's fair to say, is that the more we learn about biology and our world around us, that we'll get better at this stuff?
I think that's part of it. And the other part is that, as I've sort of seen like just when you think you figured it out, you figure out something else that's 2x faster than what you previously had. So there's a lot of that. Like I think you're never really done.
Okay.
And so it's just this, you're in this constant learning path.
Yeah.
And the question is, to me, is like, how do you like speed up that cadence of learning? And then how do you, what I'd say the next part is, how do you turn it into like an industrialization of AI in terms of the optimizations of the model together with training the model on downstream data so that's fitted more for the purpose that the end user has. And those two things can often be competing. And so that's what we're seeing is like changing on a daily basis and getting better and better techniques.
Okay.
But right now it still takes too long in terms of either compute power or time or people to optimize and transfer learn on these models. But I think that's what's fundamentally going to be completely different in a couple of years.
Yeah, I've really been thinking about ease of use with ML just because, I worked for companies like Elastic and now Grafana where we have these ML offerings that are doing anomaly detection on time series data. Very simple,
right?
If you think about it that way, but
like AI ops type stuff.
Yeah, AI ops type stuff. But like the thing that I've seen in the market is just lack of adoption. I think part of it is lack of understanding and lack of trust.
It's hard.
Right?
Yeah, it's really super hard. I mean, there's a whole new profession, right? That's created around this, the machine learning engineer, machine learning ops. And I don't know what you guys think, but I think that's just because we're in this infancy.
Yep.
My C skills are not relevant to a lot of companies anymore, right? Maybe to the cloud providers that are actually building clouds and infrastructure, but the users, right? They're not, right? They don't have to use C. C powers the things they're using. And I think the analogy I bring is that I think you'll get to the point where the machine learning engineers are building the systems, right? They're building these industrialized systems. They're building these pipelines that train easy and deploy easy. And it becomes so simple that you don't have to be machine learning yourself, a hardcore engineer, to be able to use it. You shouldn't have to. But right now, you have to download PyTorch or TensorFlow and know the ins and the outs and and you have to figure out how to get your data mapped. And it's just so much harder than it needs to be because every app is going to want to take advantage of AI in some form. But right now, the complexity is too hard for everybody that would do that. And that's why I think so many AI efforts fail today.
Yeah, I mean, based on what I've seen, I would completely agree with that. I've seen a lot of companies deciding to build it themselves because they really do believe it will be a competitive advantage. And who am I to say it won't? So it makes it interesting because there's ML companies popping up like yours and others, and you have these product offerings, but then just as many people that would download and adopt that are trying to go and build it themselves.
Yeah, and that's what you see is it's probably the other analogy, if I keep going back, is everybody built their own cloud.
Yeah.
Right. Or even farther back, Chad, like everybody had their own version of Linux. And that was a tough part of early days of Red Hat, try to get an application to load on everybody's Linux when they've already patched it up and built Mongol Linuxes. And the same thing's true of
You're fighting problems with which libc version it was compiled against and all this.
That's right. That's right.
Was it ELF or was it A.out format? All this nonsense.
And then I was the one who got to go out to California and try to get VMware, Oracle, and Veritas to all work on the same kernel, the identical kernel. And yeah, that was easy.
They'd probably had their own proprietary kernel patches. They were.
They had to. They all did the work, and so you try to.
We did at HP in our clustering product. I know you worked on True Cluster but we had service guards, so we had written this two different Linux kernel modules to make that work.
Yeah, and that's what I always say was the thing that helped Red Hat was like just standardizing a way where all those things worked on the exact same kernel with no patches. And so I think it's just early. So you see every company I see that doing AI is doing it in a different way, right? In different pipelines. But I think that's expected, but it'll get industrialized. Like you shouldn't really even have to use, PyTorch or TensorFlow, or at least you should be able to abstract it away from somebody that's trying to fit a model to their data.
Yeah.
And then the second part of that is performance should just come for free on CPUs. You shouldn't need specialty hardware. You should be able to deploy anywhere, and it should be, fast as hell and have great throughput. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to put the easy button, on ML from the perspective of performance, transfer learning, and then deployment.
So the brilliance of your product is, as you said, really just stripping out the parts of the model that aren't necessary and keeping what works, kind of like maybe like a mini max, but for ML models.
Keep what works, and then on the deployment, and that's the ML side, and then on the engine side, you're building it's a just-in-time compiler that takes that model and compiles it exactly toward the platform you're deploying it on. How many cores?
Are you guys hosting a cloud service then that
no, we're
people
not.
can do it in?
Not at this point in time, because that would kind of take away the flexibility. So we're just going to market right now for developers. We're not commercializing anything yet. And so we have a bunch of open source tools that plug into Python that makes anybody, or PyTorch, so that anybody using PyTorch can train the way they were. But with our plugins, they get optimization for free. And then we have an engine that developers can download and then run that model for speed on a CPU. So it's kind of the two things together. It could set yourself up for a cloud. What we don't want to do is we want to let people run AI wherever they want to. We want to let it run on their existing CPUs in the data center, at the edge, or on the cloud, right? And so I think there's been a lot of services. There's a ton of services out there that will let you run AI on their service. But the point of view that we have is that you need to run it really close to where your users are, because you don't want to ship the data far, far away when latency to the user matters. And that includes eventually being on cell phones, right? You want AI processing, right, to be happening right on mobile, right? You can't ship it into a cloud service. It's just too expensive, too slow.
Well, we wanted to ask, what industries is ML being applied in that aren't really obvious? I mean, like fast food, industrial manufacturing. How's it going to be applied in consumer products?
It's every one of those. I remember, not doing names because at Google, we had started building all of the ML APIs in 2015, really just starting to get it going, end of 2015. We always had one. It was the translation API, right? Which is what you'd expect from Google and search, right? You knew they had to have translation capabilities. But then we started building out the full complement of training as a service or vision APIs. What you see is it's happening everywhere. It's just happening with different degrees of success. I've seen, fast food, even fast food restaurants, like the areas where you would never expect it. Where I forgot the numbers were something like 75 to 80% of all dollars flow through the drive-through, which is this crazy number. And yet, so I'm seeing, not naming names, I'm looking to how do you reimagine what the drive-through experience even is, which kind of hurts my head when I think about that. Like, but they're really like looking at, and that's all around digital and AI. Like, how can we just totally change the experience, of coming through, of coming through the drive-through, seeing it in retail, using video, and not just for stockouts, but for user behavior patterns. You sort of combine it with A/B, testing. And what you find is you can like experiment really rapidly and then see what the outcomes are. Right. And so you don't have to know in advance exactly, but you can just try different experiments. We had seen big retail outlets change same store sales by 1%. That's a big number. Right. And after, I think it was a couple of weeks of experimentation.
By like trying to figure out which products should be next to which other products to increase sales.
And watching people's natural, like, where they walk and how they walk and what they, and where they go. And you can learn a lot just by watching the patterns of traffic flow, even though you think you can shape it by aisles and things. And then once you really understand user behavior that way, you can really start to understand where product placement really matters. It's much more than just level up shelf, right? It's that combined with traffic patterns and whatnot.
I hate shopping so much. I'm so happy now that like I can buy everything online, not just stuff on Amazon, but groceries. All our groceries get delivered now since the pandemic, and
now you don't have to wipe them down when you get them, right?
Exactly. But every time I go to a new grocery store, I'm just lost. I'm like, I don't know where anything is in this particular store. Why can't stores standardize on this stuff? I don't get it.
Well, I wonder, like, Brian, how do you think that we control for things like these patterns? Like Chad and I both don't like shopping, so when I go out to the store, I go directly for what I want and I leave. When I go with my wife, it's like a all-day thing, right? Going around the aisles, taking a long time. Like, how do you optimize for one or the other, or do you just try to boil it down to the lowest common denominator?
Oh my gosh, that's interesting. Yeah, I can't pretend how they actually think about it. I'd only be guessing, but I think that's part of it, is to realize that people have different behaviors, different patterns, right? And I think that's the question, is like, when you have different users, how do you optimize to? Right. And it's easy when it's all digital world, because you quickly identify what cohort that person's in.
Yeah, it's all personalized anyway.
I think if I could go back, I I think I would study more around user experience, right, and behavior, and because I think that's what builds great products, whatever that product is, and a physical experience or product as well. I just think it's harder for them to manage it, and it's interesting, right? The brick and mortar where it was going to be killed, and now it's very much a part of the omni-channel, world that's out there. I mean, even Amazon building stores is crazy.
Yeah, it's come full circle. Amazon has convenience stores. Amazon has physical bookstores.
Yeah, Whole Foods, right? Like who would have thunk it?
I know. It's so weird to see an Amazon store at the local mall. Like, what's happening right now?
I did have to go to the mall for my daughter's laptop yesterday to
An Apple store?
Bar, to the Genius Bar.
Yeah. That's the only reason to go to a mall anymore is it has an Apple store inside.
I hadn't been there, and I wasn't going before pandemic, so but boy, it was proverbial graveyard.
Yeah. I mean, I live in Phoenix, so the only reason I go to the mall is either the Apple store or the sunglass store. That's it.
There you go.
Just because I don't like to buy sunglasses online, but I'm sure that will change with Meta or something like that, where I can try them on my virtual avatar, see what they look like.
Well, we do a lot. Of course, most of our audience is solution architecture and enterprise sales. Like, is there, to what extent is AI and ML going to affect enterprise sales? Will we automate ourselves out of sales jobs?
I think, some companies are better at it than others already. No, I don't think that'll ever happen. I think there's a reason why it's called the art of selling. It's in many cases, especially enterprise, it's a trust-based relationship. I mean, you know this, right? And one of the companies that I advised thought the renewal part of that would be so much easier and cheaper than the initial sale. And I think that's can get you in a lot of trouble, right? Because it is very much a relationship, and you can't just show up at the time of a renewal and expect that, it's where have you been the last 12 months and how have you expanded? So I think that's very much an art. And I think that's the tough part of sales, isn't the willingness of the sales professional are the people you're selling to even there, right? Yeah. So you can go and build relationships. But I think it's going to stay that way. I think that what's missing, I see, is would be more not to replace sales, but how do you empower? Was the sales team empowered with data that better understands what phase the journey their customers on, right? Because it's just everybody's on their own journey and there are different phases in that. And so how do you really understand that better? And then how do you really understand and what's your KRs, what's your key results on how you can help them along that journey, and can you sign up, right, for those key results? And that's much more than just selling software.
Yeah, I look at enterprise sales and compare and contrast to like consumer sales a lot, just to see what trends from consumer sales will transfer over to enterprise sales. So one of the examples I like to use a lot is like Spotify or Netflix. I didn't get sold that tool or that piece of software by a sales rep. I just made a choice, and it's easy because it's cheap, and I'm not thinking about the risk of the decision or how long I'm going to stay a customer. So when I pick Spotify, it's like, look, they have the songs I like, they have the features I like. Great. I stay now because of the playlist feature. Like, I can't move my playlist to iTunes very easily, and people that build tools want to charge me for that. No thanks. It's like, who really cares? But when it comes to enterprise sales, like, I'm making potentially a multi-year or maybe a decade plus commitment, and I can't get this wrong. Yeah, but I think I agree with that. Like, that part of sales is the art, in my opinion. But the science stuff to me is like ripe for innovation, like the procurement process and the legal process.
Totally, completely. And that's what I always say is the user experience.
Yeah.
Right. It's really easy for a company, especially on the vendor side, on the sell side, to focus on technology and what that problem that technology solves, but then to wrap that in a really bad experience. And I've always felt that experience starts from the very first time. How easy was it the product to be discovered in the first case, and then from there, how easy was it to consume it, right? Adopt, consume, use, right? Yeah. Which are all things that have nothing to do with the technology. Yep. Right? It's that user experience. And so I think there's so much emphasis that needs to be put on that. And I think that's the parallel is what the consumer space has done so well at, right? Is using that Spotify app is a great experience. It really is. And procuring it's easy, and saying goodbye is easy. That's where enterprise software needs to learn And I think some companies have done a pretty good job with that, but most still focus on technology.
Yeah. I know in SaaS companies, the kind of dream is to have a product-led sale, right? Like, I think Datadog is a great example in the industry of a company that just really did a great job of the product-led sale.
Yeah.
And now they're starting, they've been building out their field for a while, but now they're getting into like the bigger strategic deals and multi-year commitments and things like that. And that does take more finesse and relationship and trust. So
but you should be like, what a awful experience it would be trying to pitch a company on using a product when the company's not already using that product.
Yeah.
Like, what a benefit if the company's already has brand awareness of who you are.
That's right.
And they already have they've had use cases and their developers or IT are already using the product. Like, I wouldn't want to ever build a company that wasn't down that product adoption journey ahead of a commercial transaction. Right. It's just,
it's like, I've been saying this lately at my company, like open source software goes before you and makes all the crooked places straight, because it is so much easier and better to go and like, I think I stole it from the Bible or some philosophy book I read. I think that's where I got it. I can't remember. But anyways,
got to steal from the best sources.
Yes, that's right. So this idea though is like, you walk in and everybody loves your software. They want to talk to you. They're very happy to talk to you. They'll bash Oracle with you, whatever. But it's also tricky because you're trying to convert someone to go from free to fee.
Yep.
And so it's like, what really is worth making that commitment to actually buy this thing that we've been using quite successfully for a while?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes it hard to come into an open source sales motion from a proprietary motion is the proprietary sales folks, they want to lead with a pitch. It's like, no. Lead with trying to understand how they're using the software and why they chose to use it and whether or not the open source is good enough. Because a lot of times it is. They don't need to switch off to your enterprise product just yet because maybe they're not growing that fast or you don't have that compelling feature that will get them to convert.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. So at Elastic, we used to joke that like, look, we have so many downloads. If we get even 1% of these, like that's billions and billions of dollars as a company value. And the same thing at Grafana. Like there's so much adoption of it.
Yeah. And I think those were always if I recall, like, the metrics were always in that 1%, 2%, 3% range, right, of monetization of open source.
How do you think society is going to wrap its arms around the sort of ethical and legal pieces having to do with AI and machine learning? I mean, we see, of course, Facebook's in hot water all the time with Instagram and how it affects, how its recommendations and things affect teen girls. I'll share another article here on the screen. Of course, we'll put the link in the show notes about recently New York City passed a bill requiring biased audits for AI tools that do hiring because they found that these AI-based tools that scan resumes and identify the right candidates maybe show a bias for certain, genders and racial lines and things like that. So New York has passed a law requiring, and this is just the beginning, but it was a 38-4 vote. This is not at all along party lines or anything like that. Everybody pretty much agreed with it. So society's still trying to wrap its arms around how we deal with these algorithms. Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
It's a real problem already, and it's just going to get worse, right, on kind of current trajectory. And it's based on a number of things, but, one is, you've just the data sets, right? And the data sets are going to teach the model, based on what the data sets know and the patterns. And if there's already bias already, then building AI is going to
amplify it,
bring that bias into a system. We've all been aware that bias has already been present, and I hope this shines a light on that and not just the AI side of it. That just we already inherently had bias in our companies and how we do things.
But do you think companies should still take the move fast and break things approach and then deal with the legal problems when they crop up? Or is there some better way? I mean, maybe that's the best we can do. I don't know, but
yeah, no, I love the move fast and break things, but I think you have an inherent responsibility in this that can't apply. The thing that I thought about as hard as well is the explainability of AI is really hard because these models are trained, but often you can't back map and explain and document why it predicts the way it does, and that therein is a problem of its own right. And you can argue that's true of bias, but it's true just even more broadly we can't run the world on black boxes that we trust just because we've trained them, right? And they seem to work. And so I think the whole field of explainability is going to be super important.
I've been listening to the Huberman podcast a lot, which is, he's a neuroscientist and at Stanford. And so he talks a lot about various aspects of the brain and the body and from a health point of view. But he did an episode that I listened to this week, kind of in preparation for our episode here. He had Lex Friedman on from the Lex Friedman podcast. They were talking about AI, and he was talking about just common sense. Okay, you can have a 5-year-old and they can identify the difference between a dog and a cat. Like, you didn't necessarily need to teach them, like, this is a dog, that's a cat, that's a dog, that's a cat. Different breeds of dogs might look wildly different, but you still know it's a dog just by looking at it. How do you teach a computer to just know the difference between a dog and a cat? Or just how do you teach a computer to have common sense? Not that you ran a model and said, here's a bunch of dogs and here's a bunch of cats, but you have an AI which went out and looked at billions of pictures and figured out that there's this thing called a dog and there's this thing called a cat, and here's the difference in them. Yeah. You didn't have to train it on the differences there.
Think about how new this is. The challenge is that it's showing so much value in some places, but it's not ready. It hasn't solved for these problems that we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
As the eternal optimist, I just can't even imagine what it's like in 15 years.
That's interesting, Brian. Like, one of the ways I think about this is I make jokes sometimes with my buddies about the hubris we have sometimes in thinking that we can design this benevolent AI, and you see it in art all the time, Terminator or iRobot or whatever. We have this kind of tendency towards violence, it seems like, as a humanity, and we don't really, at a large scale, understand ourselves that well or take the time to understand ourselves. And so why do we think we can create this benevolent thing when we ourselves are not benevolent? It's just like we're lying to ourselves, right?
Yeah, that's depressing for a very optimistic person.
I know. I'm a glass half full type of person too. I'm just like,
but you're right. Like,
there's got to be a way to do this, but we have to be honest with ourselves more and more, and like look in the mirror and say, how can I possibly create something that makes the right choice at the right time? And who decides what the right choice is?
My awakening over these past couple of years as well has been like how different we all are. I don't think I had that appreciation.
Like, how can flat earthers even believe that, Like,
yeah.
I understand that people have tons of different political beliefs based on how you're raised, but I mean, the earth is not flat.
Yeah.
It's just go up in space and look at it.
Yeah. I think it's that together with we're all in different places on that flat earth, different values, different friends, different jobs, different, everything. We can't stereotype who the person is that we're building AI for. And then we certainly can't stereotype the data that we're using to build the systems in one way or the other.
Is that going to be the hardest part of AI in the future, is defining the fitness function?
I think it depends on what you're building AI to do. We tend not to redefine what the data set is, because we're not a consumer, we're a provider. And so in many cases, if you were to take a state-of-the-art vision model, and if a company that wanted to apply it to their data, they're inherently may or may not get different degrees of bias based on that. Or the same thing's true of sentiment analysis, right? Applying sentiment analysis and downstream training it at a company on their call center data will reflect, what comes into the model will reflect based on the type of data that comes in and their customers and how they feel about them. And so it's really not the architecture of what I say the upstream model is. It's around the downstream data sets that you're transfer learning and you're applying and you're teaching the model on, right?
So it's not just that there's bias in the model, it's that there's, or the fitness function, but there's also bias in the data.
Yeah. That's what it is. The model's an architecture. The model doesn't inherently bring that. It's really the data that it's certainly it's true of the upstream data that you have, but more often than not, it's the downstream data that people are adding on to it as well. So it's really going to be based on the application. If you're a retail company, you're training it on building a recommendation engine, and how good that data is reflects on how will influence how good the model is to predict that. So there's a lot of practical uses of AI that can take advantage of the state of the art that don't have to worry about this. But the ones that we see are the flag big social platforms. That's really the ones that make the news. But that's why a lot of that is going to be incumbent on those companies, right? To just, I'd say it, to care more.
Well, Brian, maybe this is a good segue to talk about AI in other industries, because one of the things I always find fascinating is these articles that pop out every once in a while about AI designing something. And one of the ones that I read last year was AI designing a car. There was another one where they used AI to design a bridge or something like that. I can't remember exactly where I found that one. But does like bias and all that stuff come into play here too? Where you're just trying to design a new part for a car and you're using AI to do it? Like, does it matter?
I would think not, but not an expert on the application on that side. A lot of the challenges for AI is it's the garbage in, garbage out. AI is only good as obviously the quality of the model, right? The architecture of the model. That's actually hopefully stays open source like it has been, like all the research and the ability for models to learn. They're getting bigger. They're taking less compute, more memory, but they learn and retain more. And then you're starting to see models that are good at more than one thing.
Yeah.
As well, right? Which is also useful. Instead of having thousands of models based on different use cases, that's hard to manage in its own right.
What do you mean model? What do you mean models being good at more than one thing?
There's a class of architecture called transformers, and there's different models that it can do like would power a chatbot, like question and answer. You ask a question, it gives you the answer. That same architecture transformers can also be used for sentiment analysis, or like what were the objects that were, in this paragraph that were the point of the discussion, and how does the writer in this case like feel about those objects, etc. Those are often in different worlds, right? Like you have to know like what you want to use AI for, and then you have to select the right architecture and find the right data to train it. There's early research that's bringing that kind of together. You aren't picking one of 1,000 different models based on what you want to do. Before you start training it, the models will get more general purpose.
Well, why is that good?
You still get the same result, at the end, like the deployment and the application of AI. It's just back to how hard it is for machine learning engineers.
Oh, just easier to manage and deploy and everything.
Easy to manage and easy for the production side.
You've been at the lead of a lot of companies in your career. Like, how hard is it to manage an organization at the scale of these companies you worked at? Because like I'm a leader, and the biggest team I've ever managed is 125 people.
Yeah.
And I found at Elastic, it got increasingly hard for me to do that because I tell myself that I value the human relationship, and I feel like I do. But as the organization gets bigger, like how do you manage that
It was only hard because I cared about it. It mattered to me. It was the culture of the organization.
Yeah.
Like how do you like influence culture? Because you can't set culture. Because you and I would probably align and agree what we wanted the culture to be, but just because we want it to be, that doesn't mean it's going to be that.
That's right.
The parts that always came easy to me were the structure of the organization, avoiding duplication, team size, bringing in leadership. Like I always spent a lot of time recruiting at all levels of the organization. But the hardest part was like, how do you influence culture when you can only have so many conversations, right? And things like that. And all hands doesn't get it done. Google with like the TGIFs, right? They started doing that, I believe, from the very beginning. But I think the effect they had in the earlier years based on the effect I saw when I was at Google are completely different. Like it's not solving the problem. Yeah. You know what I mean? That probably was originally around culture and ask me anything. And they always say like with companies, it's easy to scale to the first, million or, and then your next bump is getting to 10 and then it's 50. And there's like the road gets steeper, if you will. You know what I mean? It's certain parts of the journey. It's not this like linear slope. And I think the same thing's true of organization. The difference between managing 1,000-person organization and a 5,000-person organization, not hugely significant. I'm an organizational design freak. One of the things you can do as a leader is like, you're not going to figure anything out. Is like hire great people and then focus on organizational alignment and resources to empower them. And I spent a lot of time on that side of it.
That's a perfect segue into the question I wanted to ask, because at some companies, like at Red Hat, engineering rolled up separately from the office of the CTO. The VP of engineering was, a separate reporting structure. At MongoDB, engineering rolled up to the CTO. Right. And originally the CTO was, the founder, and he wrote most of the code to begin with, or a lot of it anyway. And he was still writing a lot of code every day. He was in there really running the organization himself. But he has since moved on to a robotics company that he started, and they brought in a new CTO from Amazon, Porter, and I think engineering still rolls up to him. So how do you make these decisions around, whether engineering rolls up to the CTO or not?
Ignore the title and pick the right person, right? Based on the qualities that person has. People would often ask me, because I often had both titles. For me, the CTO title it was just a reflection of an attribute of what I did, a reflection of who I was, not a role or responsibility. So I never treated it like that. Like even at Red Hat, I was, VP of engineering before I was CTO. And the CTO title came later. It was just added on. It didn't change what I did on a day-to-day basis, because as a VP of Eng, I cared about what products we were building for, and could we get the right people to build those products, and were we user empathetic, and did we work really closely with marketing and sales, because they're our clients, to make sure that we can get this to users, and how did we think about innovation, right? Like, how did we think about strategy and innovation and competition, and what should be go into an open source foundation, or what should be ours. And so I cared so much about those things, as part of, because that's what you should care about if you're building product. And so the CTO title of Red Hat was just added on because of that. It didn't all of a sudden, change anything. Like I think it's very hard for organizations to split those two things apart.
And what about this relatively new role that we're starting to see in the field with the field CTO? I know this has kind of become part of the career path for solution architects. Previously, you could, of course, be an SA manager. You could maybe move into product management if that was your role. I mean, my mentor when I became an SA at Red Hat was Shubhendu Ghosh, and he moved into product management at Red Hat. And now we're starting to see this field CTO become another option. So what do you think about this role, and really, what do you think that person should be doing?
I think it's good, because at least the way how I would think about it was, customers often want to engage with experts at some point in the discussion, or they're working together. There's different people they want to engage with, but at some point you want to engage with like an uber technical executive. It's great to be able to dedicate people to that function that scales, because if the counterpart that they always have to engage with is taking a day out of their billing product, right, then that's not ideal. You want to do that. I mean, even an engineering organization wants to be very customer facing, right? You have to be, and that's how you get empathy. But it doesn't scale to be just talking to customers, all day long, 5 days a week. And so to build counterparts, in the field that are every much strong, right, technically, strategy, architecture, as the product CTO, allows an organization to scale, to support customers, is better for customers, because then they get more time from an expert. And it's a super great career path where you don't feel you have to go into product just because you want to be working more with sales. So I think done right, I think it's, super interesting. And that's why I built a kind of common model when I went to Google. I ran product, and that included a variety of things, developer advocates as well. So it wasn't just product managers. And one of the things that Diane Green and I and Ors decided to build was a CTO office. And so I didn't have the CTO title at Google yet. So it was kind of fun that there was no CTO at that time. I became that later. But we built a CTO office of people that were super strong technically, but then also super strong understanding business use cases for technology. They were former VPs of Eng at Spotify, as one example, because we were talking about Spotify earlier. And then instead of them having a lot of inward duties, they became 80% outbound and maybe 20% inbound. And it was super great for customers to be able to engage with that level of talent that before were probably always building product, but now they're in the field. And so to have a model, I mean, they were very much field CTOs, although they weren't in the sales organization. They were kept closer to engineering, and that was great, because then they really were in the know, like around, they were in all the engineering meetings, and that just empowered them to be more impactful in the field. So maybe, Chad, the thing is to add another layer onto that to make it successful is with the field CTOs is you want to find that path where they're engaged at a deeper level on the engineering side inside the company.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I mean, how do you do that if 80% of your time is in the field, or even being thought of as kind of like an Uber SA or an SA that can be brought into executive conversations? How do you stay in touch, or how do you operationalize that job so that they still have influence in the engineering team?
It's all mutual respect, right? Like influence isn't just given, right? Like it's earned. And like the best engineering organizations are going to want to tap into that field knowledge, right? But you got to create the awareness in those conduits and those key times where they spend together. You don't want to have to be involved in everything. Like you wouldn't want to be in every engineering meeting. There's a lot of burdensome stuff, on the building product side. but you definitely have to find the right points of engagement. And maybe that's every other week staff meetings, extended staff meetings kind of thing. So you kind of come in and see how the engineering team is reasoning about solving certain problems or roadmaps or technology decisions, right? Because you got to find that way. You got to find that way to build those relationships.
Yeah. I love the Field CTO role for a few reasons, but one of them is like it kind of creates this collaboration at the CTO level within an organization where it's not just one person making all the choices now. It's the almost like a hive mind of people that are out talking to customers all the time. They all bring their own backgrounds. And I'm actually looking at Grafana right now to build out the Field CTO organization. I'm trying to figure out what different backgrounds do I need, right? Because I want it to be this Venn diagram overlapping of all the talent and experience that comes.
Yeah, and we did is I would bring in one of two things. You either were super strong, like a technical expert in some area. So, maybe you were a Kubernetes kind of, DevOps person, or maybe you were analytics, or maybe you were, mobile apps or whatever. Picking technical areas was one, especially for a company that's got a broad portfolio. And then other people that were brought in came out of a domain where they really understood, user domain. Maybe it wasn't an expert in any one technical area, but they came out of financial services, or they came out of health, or they came out of
gaming or something. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, we had gaming as well. You can be a technologist that just really knows, that industry really well. That's super valuable for the field, super valuable for customers, and it's super valuable for an engineering organization, to be honest, right? To test ideas and to learn. And at Google, I built this mashup of kind of 40-ish people that had either like domain industry experience, expertise, or technical expertise. They were all technologists, hardcore technologists, but in different ways.
Talking about mergers and acquisitions, of course, Red Hat did many acquisitions while you were there. JBoss being the first big one that I remember after I joined. I'm sure you did many before that. How do you, when you have this idea for a company that you want to acquire, how do you make that happen behind the scenes?
Well, hopefully you're already trusted. Right. It always comes back down to that. I spent a fair bit of time with sort of the key technologists, like across the group. It doesn't matter where you're at. And then, but mostly on the Red Hat side, where we did more acquisitions than Google had. And then typically what I do before that part of influence was to just get to know the company more. Like, so I always spent a lot of time with companies that I thought like, sure, could be a future acquisition or a future partnership, but also were just generally is like, this company's doing something different than we are that I think would be super impactful, like for users that are in kind of our enterprise infrastructure space. So I remember in the early days, it was Cloudera team, like from when there were 50 people, right? Or trying to understand this whole Hadoop thing. Could it be general purpose, right? And with Zen in the early days when Zen just started to become a thing and flew to Cambridge, England, and there was 20 people there of us that were having the technical planning sessions around Zen, right? Including the fact before there was a company there, right? And just trying to get involved in whatever that effort is earlier and learning more about it and getting to know the people that are there first. That was true of KVM as well.
When you bought Kubernetes, yeah.
It was Kubernetes, right? It was the same thing. It was just spend a lot of time. There's a lot of relationship building and understanding that happens prior to the acquisition. For us, we were never a company that just said, we want that, like, go get that. Most companies wouldn't want that. They care about life after. So a lot of time, like that knowledge, relationship building, that understanding, that's spending time with a team, and it's not just over weeks, it could be over months or years even, then, that's socialized internally. So people are well aware of who the company is and what they could mean. I mean, my failed one was Martin Casada and Nicera, right? I had spent so much time because I just thought SDN, open source SDN, right, would be, fits really well with everything we're doing around compute. We were doing storage, but we had nothing in networking. And Nicera just figured that out. Martin figured that out. So I spent countless hours, with them, and it's just
doing what? You're talking about spending hours with them over months and years, like.
They're always willing to meet and understand, right? Because obviously they care about access, things like that. So that part's easy. But a lot of it was trying to better understand their product, trying to brainstorm ways that like the two companies and the two products could work better together, what types of things you could get some time to brainstorm what you could build for customers, understanding what adoption looks like for them so you can better understand the metrics and how well they're doing. It's just these technical understandings, these customer understandings, these future product understandings, and you're building relationships along the way. At least with like that case, by the time we went to it like we weren't just any other quantity, right? Like if it was ever multiple companies pursuing, it was never really much of a challenge, on the Red Hat side for the executive team to get behind an idea like that. Though that was not really that hard. It was just around, everything has its price. Like how far do you go, right? It was really just the bidding strategy, and typically we left that to the CFO, and it worked pretty well.
Brian, how do you think about spacing out acquisitions? I would imagine you have to digest the ones that you acquire, and
some are harder than others. Like, some are bigger and more difficult, and some are kept separate, right? Like JBoss is really kept as a division for many years. So it really just depends, on that. And then there's the balance sheet, right? So I think I found myself more chasing what the future technical architecture of open source look like. Like what's the surface area, look like of the problem that you're solving for customers. And you always want to broaden that and solve more of the problem for them and integrate and build that. We're back to the Spotify experience of enterprise infrastructure, right? And so a lot of those were technical companies. So what you also had to do is you had to worry about like the business dynamics, back then, because, Red Hat wasn't always the big company that it was then. We weren't typically chasing non-dilutive deals, right? Ones that like you could procure and maybe leave as a division and they didn't have a drag on earnings, right? The ones that we were bringing in staff, right? That we, that was coming out of our headcount. So I always tried to make sure that there was budget and staffing room, because a lot of the pace was more around funding it. Could we afford to fund 20 more engineers or 50 more engineers? And so by keeping room, and then our team is really good at staff. We're willing to trade off hiring to bring in new teams of people in certain areas. So, and so we would do some of that if we needed more, right? People were like really wanted, like, different teams to come in. Like, in the end, it was, Sage, right? And the company, right? As well as one example of that. Things that weren't planned.
Chad, one of the things you and I had talked about is like different industries that drive technology innovation or adoption in a more accelerated way. And we were joking about the adult entertainment industry.
Right.
How, like the Blu-ray versus HD DVD thing.
Streaming video was in large part driven by people who wanted to stream porn and stuff.
Yeah. What's the question in here?
So Brian, there's a question, I promise. So the question is like, when you look at the industries that exist today, is there one or two or three that stick out as like the ones that are going to drive the innovation in ML and AI for the next 5-10 years?
I thought you were going differently with that. Like AI is interesting because in and of itself, like especially if you look at a cloud, pure AI doesn't drive a lot of consumption dollars and cost. It's the storage at rest. It's the network bandwidth that the applications use, and it's the compute power for running the apps. That's where the revenue flows, for cloud. It tends to not be just the API for doing the object detection box, around it. Like those are, I think the best way to think about those is those are pieces of an application rather than the application itself. And so often not having them means you don't get the application. And so that's why we had done that. Like they were the things that like people will come to you because you have great AI, but they need a lot of other things as well. A lot of the big consumption that is going to drive a lot of this is all the robotics and autonomous cars, right? Yeah. All the simulation, all the sensors, just all the modeling. And a lot of that is really driving and maturing, different aspects of AI. Then that's on the developer side, because a lot of that hasn't realized, production yet, but that's okay, because that's what makes, that's like building that first version of Mongo we talked about out in open source that makes it so great, because it wasn't running enterprise production workloads in the beginning. It took a lot of years of people building it for singleton apps, right, before it became big and ready.
What about the space of AR and VR? Here, let me share something. So Facebook partnered up with Ray-Ban and launched these glasses called Ray-Ban Stories. And you remember Google Glass and the people walking around and they look like the Borg and it had this giant thing on the side. And
there's 2 sets of those that they gave to the kids right in this class right here of the old ones.
Right, but these are much more sleek. Like they look like regular glasses. You can see there. Yeah. If I can get it to stop moving. It's just got glasses on each side of the the lenses, and otherwise they look like normal Ray-Bans. And so I think this is obviously going to be much more ubiquitous moving forward if we can make it unobtrusive, or even if people don't even know you're wearing them.
Yeah.
But I'm so
That's
excited for
cool.
this because I can't wait to walk around and have, just see Yelp ratings on restaurants or something as I
Right?
walk around
Exactly.
Manhattan and know which one to walk into. Yeah. So how does AI fit into this space of?
I think I'm by no means an expert on where they're at, like what types of models are being consuming. Like, for us, it's just been everywhere around. Like the minute if you think you're going to build like one AI system to slay them all, that convergence of models, notwithstanding that I was talking about. It's crazy. It's just whether you call it the democratization of AI or the federation, it's just that AI is going to be in every device, right? And so you've got this world where the part that we see is like AI is going to be in every device. Like, it's going to be, in this microphone, in that camera, right? Just because the camera's going to auto adjust better, right? Like and so everything's going to have some semblance of AI in it. And then the other path is the state of the art of what AI is. It's just getting richer and richer, and it's creating the models to be able to do that are getting bigger and bigger and smarter. And so like the worlds are kind of going apart because you got what we're calling like big AI is happening here. And then you can need mainframes to run it on. And then you've got the world of like AI going everywhere and every little device. And that's why we're trying to bring it together. We're trying to take the biggest of AI and make it a small, simple problem from what it can run on, so that you can run AI and glasses like that without carrying a jetpack on your back, right? with big fans and coolers in it, right?
Why would most of that processing be done in the cloud anyway? I mean, that's where all the memory's gonna be.
It's just the latency side of it. You'd be standing there waiting for it to load and tell you what the Yelp ratings on that building were. And that's fine if you want to wait 5 seconds. And then there's data shipping, right? And then you got a bandwidth requirements and data shipping. But the reality is if you have to have dumbed down AI in order for it to fit, on the power, the form factor and not drain your battery, of a cell phone, then that's a problem. So we're trying to like make the AI models you bring not a compromise and make it fit on a, small ARM chip.
That's funny. I keep waiting for battery technology to somewhat not outpace, but just keep pace with all the technology innovations happening. Like those Ray-Ban glasses, the battery only lasts 3 hours. I don't want to charge my sunglasses on the road during a drive, right?
Exactly. And then when you start to think about like bringing it, not trying overly hard to bring it back to neural magic, but inference, but like when we're running on, a cloud, then it's about throughput, hit 1 millisecond latency, kind of thing, max out however many cores you gave us. But then when you're running an edge device, you measure in power, watts, right? Watts per inference.
Brian, are you saying that one of your value propositions is going to be number of inferences per watt?
That's you kind of have to go there in some cases. Yeah.
That's interesting.
The problem is that space is so early. You look at like how people benchmark and what part of the processing of AI they actually measure. You and I know like it should be end to end.
Yep.
Right. Like it should be an application wants to do a prediction, then you should measure the whole cost of that prediction, which means massaging the data. Maybe it has to be converted to a different resolution or a different form factor. Like that counts. The processing counts, and then the reply, putting the data back.
Yeah.
But like there's so much, in this world, like how they benchmark, but they don't measure full end to end. Like we take all that path and we put it inside of a cache engine, right? End to end. But there's a lot of like forget about the other two parts of it.
Yeah.
Which Amdahl's law, like you can speed up the middle part, but if you don't speed up the other two parts, then that's all for naught.
That's right. It doesn't matter.
Well, we just have some news topics that have happened in the last few weeks. We wanted to run by you and get your thoughts here at the very end. Famously, Ireland had very low or no taxes on corporations, and so people were moving their HQs there and playing all these tax games. But now they have entered into this international agreement to have at least a 15% tax on corporations. Like, how do you think that's going to affect will people send fewer jobs to Ireland now that it's not free from a tax point of view? Or I mean, Mongo had opened a huge office in Dublin, and Facebook and Google, I'm sure, did too, and everybody else.
I think it's good, though I think it's good. I know that I would assume there's going to be an impact, but it was going to happen ultimately. Look at what Amazon has to deal with on a state-by-state basis. And it prevented them from even doing business in certain, even having employees in certain states because it doesn't need to be taxed in that state. Like, that's just broken. I think it's good. I think the level playing field around taxation is good.
But do you think it's bad for Ireland? I mean,
That's probably not great.
that's why I was wondering why they would even agree to it. It's like,
yeah, well, you're in the EU.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well, you never know how long that's going to last.
Yeah. Yeah. I was surprised at the number that actually did agree to it, to be honest.
So Steve sent me this article, Facebook testing AI to get you to stop fighting. This is really like true social engineering.
Yeah.
And this was an interesting use of AI just to get people to stop disagreeing so much. Of course, huge fights in forums and things, and filter bubbles, and people not even liking their neighbors sometimes. So I thought this was an interesting use of AI.
Is that the fox guarding the hen house?
Exactly. But I mean, we think about AI, like these big companies already control so much what information we see and products that we buy and all these things. This was really felt a little more invasive. What if I want to fight with people? Maybe I'm in there because I want to fight, or just debate. Really, I mean, I like to do debates online.
Fighting's fine, and fighting's healthy. It's just, let's not try to like bring more people into the fight necessarily, which is where they were before. Don't measure your OKR shouldn't be the number of people engaged in that fight.
Well, that was their OKR was just growth and clicks, and anything.
Yeah, exactly.
More clicks and more eyeballs, right?
Yeah. So you gotta have the right OKRs.
I mean, I think that's the challenge. Is it feels to me like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because sometimes what it may think is a fight is just a really good conversation about something, and two people trying to find a shared understanding, and then, or multiple people, and then they'll break in and do what they're going to do. But then basically they're deciding what is a fight and what's not, and when it needs to be broken up and when it doesn't. And I don't know that that's the right thing to do either.
Minimally, you probably need to start being more aware around sentiment, than perhaps they were before. Before it was like number of reads and responses and whatnot, but let's at least have a better understanding of the sentiment of the topic, I would think.
Well, I think the other one I think about too is intention. It's like, what are my intentions when I engage into one of these things? And I don't know. I don't think computers can really tell me, what someone's intention was today, maybe in the future.
Yeah, and certainly not instantly. And what data are you going to train it on? And do you trust that data?
Yeah. And then the other thing I was thinking about the other day is like, my intentions, the way I communicate has changed over the years because I've learned and grown. And you could misjudge someone's intentions because they're just not a great communicator.
Right.
And I think that's the other thing too.
And remember, like we say this, how hard it is to convey your meaning through nonverbal forms, right? And especially in a world where you're busy and you're trying to be terse, like you got to communicate, but you're too terse. And then think how easy that is when you're face to face or verbal, and you can see body expressions and and so imagine how hard it is in that world that they're trying to solve for this, where they don't get the benefit of any of that.
All right, everybody. Hey, that's been a great conversation, Brian. Thanks so much for joining us and being our first CEO on the podcast.
Yeah,
you were very gracious in spending 2 hours with us. I really appreciate it.
That was fun. Thanks, Chad. Thanks
a lot. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody. If you can help us by sharing this podcast out on LinkedIn, I think that's where most people find out about it. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to ask Brian to share it once I post it too. Maybe we'll get some new viewers through his network. That would be really, really great. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, everybody.